Morning to you all. Did that air bother you as much as it did me? I didn't get up to 7:30. I didn't even get a chance to go over my lesson this morning. So we'll hope I got the right one and see how it goes. We're going to begin our survey of the Bible today. I want to begin by doing an overall survey first. I think this little brief shot at the Old Testament is very important. It gives us a general understanding of what the intent of the entire Old Testament is. Paul the Apostle said whatever things were written before were written for our learning. Romans 15 and verse 4. The Old Testament has been preserved. A lot of people don't think it's important, but it is important. I remember there was a time when I didn't study the Old Testament at all because I didn't know the Bible, so I thought I need to generate all my energy towards the New Testament, and I'm not so sure that was a bad idea. But there came a time when I needed to learn the Old Testament. I realized that because there was so much of the New Testament I couldn't understand. But despite what some think, the Old Testament not being important, some churches, as a matter of fact, won't even let you teach the Old Testament because the elders think it's a waste of time. But you can learn a lot from the Old Testament about God, about His attitude towards us. The principles of the Old Testament are the same today as they've always been. The only thing that changed is the ceremonial law. There's two kinds of law. There's the moral law and the ceremonial law. The moral law never changes because it's rooted in the nature of God Himself. You should not shed innocent blood. It never changes. You look at patriarchal law, Genesis 9 and 6, it was wrong. You look at the law of Moses, it was wrong. You look at the law of Christ, it is wrong. It's a moral law. It's always wrong. The ceremonial laws, on the other hand, they change. There was a time when there was no circumcision. Then when Abram come into the picture, there was circumcision for him and his descendants, the Hebrews, alone. And today there is no circumcision again. Ceremonial law, they do change. So when we talk about not living by the Old Testament law, we don't live by the ceremonial law. But the moral law, the moral precepts that we learn from the Old Testament are as true today as they ever were. And it can be of a great deal of value to us as we study the Old Testament scriptures. This is the general area that the Old Testament covers. Down here in the left, that's Egypt. Of course, there's a lot to do with Egypt in the Old Testament. That is that's the Sinai Peninsula, generally referred to in Scripture as the wilderness, where Israel spent 40 years. Up there, of course, is the land of Canaan. And then up in the northern part, that's the heart of the Assyrian Empire, and then later the heart of the Babylonian Empire. As we go through our study, when I start breaking it down, we're going to have to look at these areas a little bit more and try to understand what was going on at that particular time. We got 10 words. I think if you commit these words to memory, you will be able to master the gist of the Old Testament. And it's not really that hard. The first word is the word beginnings. The Israelites they went to Mount Sinai after the captivity. Sometime between their being at Mount Sinai and the death of Moses, the first 5 books of the Old Testament were written, okay? Because Moses is the author of those first 5 books. Now, what's significant about that? Well, he's talking about creation, for example, in Genesis chapters 1 and 2. So he's talking about something that happened 2,500 years ago. Okay, he's speaking by divine inspiration. God is telling him what he did when he created the heavens and the earth. So Moses is recording historical facts. The second word we have here is Hebrews. It has to do with the family of the Hebrews, which is important, of course, to the Israelites. So now he's talking about a time frame that began about 500 years ago. Remember, the Israelites are in the Sinai Peninsula. They don't know how the heavens and the earth came to be. They just don't know. They have no way of knowing. There's no written record of anything. They don't even know for sure what their family tree is anymore. There's a lot of water that's flown under the bridge, so to speak, since the time of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were slaves in the land of Egypt for 150 years, perhaps 200 years. Their roots had been lost for the most part. They knew bits and pieces only. Imagine 200 years, the beginning of our country without written records. What would our understanding of the beginning of our country be? It would be very brief. It would probably be very wrong. We wouldn't understand a whole lot that actually happened. Because over a period of 200 years, mouth to ear, mouth to ear, mouth to ear, a lot is lost during that time. Well, when you have the beginnings and the Hebrews, Moses is writing about something that happened a very long time ago. What's he doing? He's trying to show the Israelites how they came to be. They're in the Sinai Peninsula. They're people of God. They're called Israelites. They are now a nation. Well, how did this happen? So here's the reason for the book of Genesis. This is the whole purpose of it. Beginnings covers Genesis chapters 1 through 11. Covers about 2,000 years. When you get to the Hebrews, how did the Hebrew family come into existence? Well, there was your great-great-great-great-grandfather, Abram. And then there was his son, Isaac. Then there was his son, Jacob. And then there was a story of Joseph, how Joseph came to be in the land of Egypt, how he rose to power, how he won the favor of the Pharaoh. And when a great famine struck the earth, his family was spared from the famine because of Joseph's position in Egypt. He brought his family down to Egypt. Okay? That's the purpose of the book of Genesis. It's just that simple. How did they come to be? Who made the sun? Who made the stars? Okay? Well, God did. They're being introduced to God, and they're being introduced to their family tree in the book of Genesis. So the beginnings would be Genesis 1 through 11. Hebrews would be Genesis, beginning with Genesis 12. Actually, it begins in chapter 11, some verse, I forgot. But rounded off to chapter 12 is much easier to remember. Chapter 12 through 50, you're dealing with the patriarchs, Abram, Isaac, Jacob, and then Joseph, because he's such an important character in the whole story. The third word you want to remember is the word bondage. This bondage that occurred is the record of Exodus chapters 1 through 19. Israel is living in the land of Egypt, okay, by means of Joseph. Life's good. We're told that they prospered, they multiplied. They became very, very wealthy, and they were numerous. Many historians estimate there were a minimum of 2 million Israelites living in the land of Egypt. Well, there were 3 dynasties that conquered Egypt during this period of time. And now you've got a foreign government who has assumed power of Egypt. You've got a Pharaoh who knows nothing about Joseph. He's not indebted to Joseph. Joseph never did anything for him. Whatever happened a few hundred years ago, he could care less. The only thing he's got on his mind is the Israelites. There's too many of them. And if they want to take over the land, they could give us a good fight. Or if they wanted to join forces with another invader, they could contribute to the overthrow of my dynasty. So the Pharaoh, he doesn't like the Israelites for that purpose. So he makes slaves out of them. He's not just going to throw them away. They're going to make good slaves. But he's got to stop the population growth. And that's why, you start killing the males who will eventually become men and be a part of any military coup. So this is how the bondage came into be. This is a gist of what's recorded in these chapters. Well, what happens? Israel decides they don't like it. They don't like it in Egypt anymore. God had made a promise to Abram that the land of Canaan would be given to his descendants when the time was right. Well, if they don't want to go back, he can't fulfill his promise. Well, now there's a new Pharaoh that doesn't know Joseph. The Israelites don't like it in Egypt anymore. They call to God, God, do something. Get us out of this place. And God heard their voice, and of course, he raised up the man Moses, who is a very important figure. But the bondage is just that period that contributed to motivating Israel to want to leave the land of Egypt and go wherever it is God's going to take them. They don't know where it is, but they want to go somewhere besides Egypt. So what we have is we have a period of 150, maybe 200 years where the Israelites are slaves. And then we have another period, and that is the birth of Moses, some 80 years before Mount Sinai, okay? Now, from Mount Sinai onward, he's going to live another 40 years. Okay, they spent 40 years in the wilderness. He's their leader. He lives to be 120 years old. But, so in Exodus 1:19, he's writing about the new Pharaoh who didn't know Joseph, who turned them into slaves. And then there is, of course, the birth of Moses recorded, because Moses is a principal player. He's going to be very important to the descendants of these people, because he is the one that God gave the law to Israel through. So Moses is a very important man. He's a type of Christ. But this is the general summary of the first three words. It's very simple. Keep it simple. It's meant to be simple. If you can remember what we've just discussed, then you've got that part mastered. We go on to the fourth word. The fourth word is the word wilderness. And this, of course, is the time spent in the Sinai Peninsula. The Sinai Peninsula was a good place for God to take Israel. He's going to take them into the Sinai Peninsula to train them, okay? They're going to stay there for 2 years. That's the idea. Remember, they're slaves. They're uneducated. They don't know how to take care of themselves as a people. There's perhaps more than 2 million people. So he takes them into the Sinai Peninsula. They can't sustain themselves there. There's not enough food, and there's not enough water. That's one of the reasons why it's referred to as a wilderness. It's not the kind of place people live, because you can't sustain life there very well without water, without food. So God takes them there. He feeds them the manna from heaven, of course, and he gives them water. Well, what does this do? It teaches them to trust God, to lean on God, that God is the one who sustains their life. They need God. And God comes through. He takes care of them. They can trust God. So during these 2 years, they're learning how to trust God, because God supplies their daily food. Remember the Lord, that model prayer, give us this day our daily bread? Well, this is what they're learning in the Sinai Peninsula. Give us this day our daily bread, literally. Well, something else was going to happen. He was going to give them the law, the religious law, the Ten Commandments, but he also was going to give them a civil law. Since they are a nation, they're going to have to govern themselves. You got to have laws, speed limits, and stuff like that. So while they're there, he trains them. The tabernacle is built. A priesthood is established. You got a way to communicate with God now through the priesthood. You got a civil law that's being established that God is giving to the people. There are leaders that are appointed to head over the people. So for 2 years, they're in training so that he can take them into the land of Canaan, give them the land, and they're going to be able to stand on their own 2 feet, so to speak, and survive as a nation. Okay? Well, the 2 years are up. Everything went just fine. The nation is ready to go. They get to the brink of Canaan land, and because of the report of these 10 spies, they're afraid they can't conquer the land. You can see why God became so angry. All the plagues they saw him do, the parting of the Red Sea. He's sustained them in the wilderness for 2 years. They have no reason not to trust God, but all of a sudden, here they are, ready to go into the land of Canaan, and they balk. 10 men say, we can't do it. God said we could. Joshua and Caleb, they said we could, but the people decide we can't do it. Well, God is furious with the people. So he assigns them to 38 more years in the wilderness. They're going to spend a total of 40 years. That's how long they spied out the land. 40 days, they spied out the land. 40 years will be their punishment. Whenever they leave the land of Canaan, everyone from above the age of 20 and above is going to die in the wilderness. So that's why they wound up spending 40 years in this wilderness. God continued to feed them. He continued to water them. But because of their sin, because of their unbelief, they couldn't go into the land of Canaan. Yeah, Jack?
Genesis 12, Exodus 12 and 40 says they were in Egypt 430 years.
Yeah. Well, they weren't slaves the whole time they were there.
You were just talking about this when they're slaves.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, they were there 430 years, but part of that time, half of that time, they were living the life of Riley, and the other part of that time, they had become slaves. That's what happened there. See, when they're living good, they don't want to go back to Canaan, which is where they have to go. But why should they? That's what happened when they were in Babylonian captivity. God opened the doors, let them go back to Judea, and only 120,000 went. All the rest of them said, I don't want to go. Why would I want to go back there? Sure, they stayed in paradise. They didn't want to leave. But that's the same problem that happened here when they were in Egypt. The first part was a very good life, and then God rose up a Pharaoh he allowed a Pharaoh to conquer Egypt who would make life hard on the Israelites. And that's when they became slaves, and life deteriorated from that point. That's why I had the short time span. Anyway, they got 40 years here in the Sinai Peninsula, and then they're eventually going to conquer the land of Israel, Canaan rather. What's interesting about this, actually fascinating to me, is that they conquered the land in 7 years. That's all it took, just 7 short years. Their fathers were afraid they couldn't conquer the land, and in 7 years they owned it. And it was a magnificent feat. The only way it could have possibly been done was the fact that God was on their side. Like the taking of Jericho, for example. The walls fell down because God had given them the city. But what they did, see how that works. They came across right about here. Just see right there about where Jericho is? They came across, they made a swath right across the land of Canaan, and then they went south, and they conquered everything in their path, and then they came back up. They had won the south, and now they turned their attention to the north, and they conquer everything in the northern part of the land. So they cut the land in half so they can't join forces with one another. They beat the south, and then they go and they take the north, and in 7 years they own the land of Canaan. And life was good. It was a life that flowed with milk and honey. They moved into houses they did not build. They started running factories they did not build. They were driving cars that were built by other people. I mean, they just went in and sat down at somebody else's table. It was theirs because God gave it to them. They destroyed everything in their sight. They were to kill all people, every man, woman, and child, when they went through the land of Canaan, because their cup of iniquity was full. They had become so sinful, like Sodom and Gomorrah, that God chose to execute them, to destroy them off the face of the earth. And he told them, if you don't do what I tell you to do, they're going to be a thorn in your side. It's going to come back to haunt you. And it did. They didn't kill all the Canaanites, and eventually that did become a problem, as God said it would. But Joshua is their leader during the period of the conquest. Moses is now dead. Joshua takes his place, and he governs the people while they capture the land and then throughout the remaining portion of his life. Well, after he dies, we enter into the period of the judges. This lasts for about 350 years. There's no king in Israel, no human king. There's a king. God's the king. But there's no human king. The book of Judges is a book that shows us how fickle humanity really is. When we look into the mirror of the book of Judges, it's disgusting to think that that's the way we are as people. It's not just those people who are fickle. I think it's a representation of all people, that we are capable of being a terribly fickle people. Basically what happened is during the lifetime of Joshua, after his death, and even after the lifetimes of the elders who lived contemporary to Joshua, the children of Israel were faithful to God. They had seen what God did, how he gave them the land of Canaan in 7 years. And they were appreciative to God for being good and for taking care of them. But eventually there arose a generation who did not know God. Well, they knew God. They knew God, who he was, but they didn't know him in the true sense of the word. They didn't know him as a friend. They didn't know him as a companion. They knew there was God. They knew God took care of them. They knew God gave them the land. They knew the facts about God. But they didn't know God as a person. There was no true relationship with God. So they began to sin. And because they began to sin, God would become angry with the people. He disciplines his children when they get out of line, as we know. And he would raise up another nation. They would come in. The Philistines were constantly a thorn in their side. He would raise up various nations. They would come in. They would conquer the people, oppress the people, certain parts of the kingdom. He would oppress them. And then the people, they would repent. They would cry to God for relief. And God would raise up a judge. He's not a judge like we think of a judge. He's a leader, is what he is. Most of the judges that were raised up, they became the head of a military. Not all of them, but most of them did. And what they would do, the judge would raise up. He would gather some kind of a force. He would fight back the oppressors, and then Israel would be free from oppression. God would deliver them, give their land back to them without the oppressors. Well, a certain amount of time would go by. They would be faithful. Then they would become unfaithful. There arose a generation that did not know God. And they would do the same thing their ancestors had done. Okay? The cycle repeats itself 15 times in the book of Judges. It's like riding a roller coaster. 15 times they fall. 15 times they're given into the hands of an oppressor. 15 times God raises up a judge and delivers them. That's what the book of Judges is. That's all you got to remember. It's really simple. Over a 350-year period, This continues to happen. The last judge is a man by the name of Samuel. He was a good man, a great man. Samuel was told by the people that they wanted to have a king. We want to be like the other nations around us. That's one of the problems religious people have always had, wanting to be like the world. We want a king. We don't want your sons to be a judge. And I can understand why they didn't. His sons weren't any good. But they wanted a king. And God told the people, if you get a king, he's going to mess you up. He's going to tax you. He's going to take your kids. He's going to make your daughters become his bakers. He's going to make your sons serve in his armies. But mostly he's going to tax you. That's what governments do. They tax. God is telling them that a government is not a good thing. I am your king. Leave it alone. But the people said, no, we want a king. So God gave them a king. That brings us into our next period, and that is united. I cheated on this one. It's supposed to be 10 words, but on this one I cheated because I inserted the word kingdom in blue. The United Kingdom, we read about it 1st, 2nd Samuel, 1st Chronicles, and 2nd Chronicles chapters 1 through 9. The United Kingdom is when the whole kingdom is one. There's harmony. The nation is there's solidarity in the nation, and there are 3 kings during this period. The first king of the United Kingdom is Saul. God chose Saul to be their king. He was the kind of a man the Israelites were looking for. He knew what they wanted. He gave them what they wanted. Saul of Kish. So Saul became the first king of Israel. He served as king for 40 years. Well, he took his own life eventually. It seems like he almost went mad. He seemed to be such a good man in the beginning, but at the end of his life, he was anything but a good man. David became the second king of the United Kingdom. He ruled for 40 years. And then eventually David died, and then his son Solomon became king. When David became king, God made a promise to David, and it's a very important promise. There's a thread that runs through the Old Testament. And that is, all the kings that follow are going to be his descendants. He cut off the house of Saul from being kings. What that means is, none of his descendants will ever serve as king again. And he told David, made David a promise that his sons would always rule as kings over Israel, which is what happened. After David died, Solomon, his son, became king. He ruled for 40 years. So the United Kingdom lasted for a period of 120 years, beginning about the year 1051 to 931 BC. Solomon was a very intelligent man in one way, but he was a fool in another way. The story of Solomon is too long to go into, but suffice it to say, in at least the latter part of his reign as king, he excessively taxed the people because he liked to spend money. He did. I mean, this guy spent a fortune. The kingdom stretched out to its farthest boundaries during the time of David and Solomon. And Solomon taxed the people excessively so he could maintain all of the various building projects that he was engaged in. Well, you know how people feel about taxes. You get tired of it. I mean, everybody wants to pay their fair share of tax. We understand it takes money to run a country. But, there is such a thing as going overboard when you spend $950 for a bolt or something like that. People start getting upset. And that's what Solomon was doing. And there was a problem that arose. Solomon died. His son Rehoboam became king, and he was a bigger fool than his daddy had been. Rehoboam, people asked him to reduce our taxes, and Rehoboam refused to do so. I should mention The divided kingdom covers the period of 1st and 2nd Kings, and then 2nd Chronicles chapters 10 through 36. During the period of the divided kingdom, the nation became smaller eventually. But during the period of the divided kingdom, Rehoboam, instead of reducing taxes, he increased the taxes on the people. The people became very angry, and they decided they didn't want him to be their king. So they chose a man by the name of Jeroboam, that he would be their king. The kingdom divided. There were 10 tribes. The northern tribes, I'll show you where they are. The 10 northern tribes, everything in the little box became the kingdom of Judah, and the rest of it was the kingdom of Israel. It's called the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. But they decided that they didn't want to be a part of this monarchy anymore. And because of the foolishness of Rehoboam, the kingdom split, and that was the beginning of many woes. A kingdom divided against itself cannot stand, and that's exactly what happened in time. But after the 120-year United Kingdom, the kingdom divides in the year 931 BC. The northern kingdom is only going to last for about 210 more years. They'll be conquered by the Assyrians to the north and to be dispersed throughout their empire. The southern kingdom will exist for 325 more years, and then they'll be taken into Babylonian captivity in the year 606. After that, we got the word captivity. The northern kingdom is gone. They're gone. They're out of the picture as far as the Bible's concerned. They're gone. The focus now is on the southern kingdom, Judah. They're taken into captivity. That means they leave the land of Canaan and they become captives in the land of Babylon. But like it was in when they were in Egypt, a lot of these people, they liked the way they were living in Babylon. Life was good. A lot of them were born there. They were educated there. They built their factories. They had their law practices, their medical practices, while they were in the land of Babylon. They really enjoyed it. But there were some, the religious element, whose hearts longed for Jerusalem. And they always wanted to go back to Jerusalem because that was the city of God. But this is a 70-year period. Jerusalem was conquered in 3 waves by Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. The first wave was in 606, the second one was in 597, 596, and then the third one was in 586. During that time, the nobles were taken as captives. The highest people in 606 were taken to Babylon. In 596, the highest people at that time were taken. As far as the common people were concerned, they weren't worried about them. They can't run a country. They're not qualified for that kind of stuff. So they're not really worried about common people. They're worried about the more educated, the rulers, the dignitaries, the princes, the princesses. These are the ones that they really want to take, and they take them to Babylon. But in 586, they take almost everybody, and Jerusalem is destroyed. Their temple, which they took so much pride in, that Solomon had built, one of the wonders of the world. It was so beautiful. It was destroyed to the ground, and they were in Babylon. And for 70 years, the clock begins in 606, and it continues till 536 BC. And then the 10th and the final word is the word restoration. We read about people like Ezra, Nehemiah, and Esther during this time frame. What happened during this time frame was that the Israelites were allowed to go back to Jerusalem. There was a king. The Persians conquered the Babylonians, and there was a king who came to power over the Persian Empire, whose name was Cyrus. His name appears in the Old Testament 12 times. God had predicted that Cyrus would be raised. He called him by name. The prophet Isaiah, for example, which would be about 200 years before, 150, 200 years before, the prophet Isaiah predicted that a man named Cyrus would come to power and that he would allow the Jews to go from Babylon back to Jerusalem. And this was even before they were taken captive, a long time, 100 years before they were taken captive. God said this man Cyrus would become a king and he would set them free. Well, it was most likely Daniel, the prophet Daniel, who was in a position to let Cyrus read the prophecies of Isaiah. He was so moved by the fact that his name appeared in that prophetic book from so long ago that he believed in the God of the Israelites. So he decided he needed to let him go. He came to power in 538 and 536. He lets him go back to Jerusalem. Not only that, but he gave them tons of money. He gave them money to rebuild the temple, to rebuild the city. I mean, he loaded them down with money. Not just one time, he gave them money again and again so that they could rebuild their country. And they did. Judea never was much after that. Now, it was hardly as big as a state, one of our United States. It makes me think of Tennessee. You know how Tennessee runs east to west, west to east? Just take Tennessee and raise it up, run it north to south, and that's kind of what Israel's like. That's all that was left of it. It wasn't, it's a nation, but it never became very large again. They never had a king anymore. The Old Testament and the New Testament, when you look at the bigger picture, the Old Testament ends with Malachi. New Testament begins with Matthew. We turn our Bibles one page from Malachi to Matthew, and suddenly we've crossed 400 years. These are known as the silent years. As far as the Bible is concerned, as far as divine inspiration is concerned, it is silent. There's nothing said. Nothing. Heaven doesn't speak. But those 400 years are not silent from a historical point of view. History enables us to learn a great deal about these 400 years and what happened to the Jews during that period of time. Paul said in Galatians 4:4, when the fullness of the time had come, God sent forth his Son. When the fullness of time had come, God was preparing the world to receive his Son. That's what he'd been doing all along. Since the beginning of time, he had been preparing the world for the advent of Jesus Christ. Well, that's what he's doing also during those 400 years. God is preparing the world during those 400 silent years. And even though the Bible says nothing, history says a lot, and we'll look at some of the things that we discover that happened during those 400 years that prepared the world for the coming of the Messiah. Daniel has a whole lot to say about these 400 silent years from a prophetic point of view. He speaks about the kingdoms that are going to come to power. He talks about the Babylonian kingdom. He talks about the Persian kingdom. He talks about the Greeks. He talks about Alexander the Great. Then he talks about the Roman kings. He does it in symbols, okay, in his book. But now that it's past, now that that's history, it's easy to see that Daniel's prophecies were dealing with this particular period of time. And when we take the book of Daniel and we lay it down beside the historical data, we can learn a whole lot that happened during that 400 years, how God was controlling everything. He was in control. Even though he wasn't speaking, he was still in control of his world. And I think that's it. Yeah.